Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. This one, a solo commentary. This is Shermer Says number 2. This one's on, I guess what I'm calling it is, are we in the 5th Great Awakening? I first started thinking about this when the number of books piling up on my desk here at the office about this subject of religion and religiosity making a comeback, just as we were processing books from last year about the decline of religion and the rise of the nuns. Here, I'll go through these individually, but just let me give you the visceral impression here of, this is the pile of books that's come in just in the last, this year, I guess, 2025, the last few months. And here's a bunch of the books that have come in just before that about the decline of religiosity. It's just to kind of give you an impressionistic view here. I'll go through some of these in a minute. But I was just thinking about this in the context of the history of religiosity and Christianity in America, roughly broken down into 4 great awakenings, as they're called. Historians track them as the first one in the 1730s and 40s. So let's just say mid 18th century. These are figures like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, where preachers stopped reading their dense sermons and congregations became more evangelical, more actively involved in the church. And this form of evangelical Christianity also spread through the African-American slave communities in America. The Second Great Awakening was roughly 1790s to 1840. Affiliated with Charles Finney and the rise of camp meetings and hellfire and damnation preaching. And this involved, appropriately enough, the abolition of the slave trade and of slavery movement, the temperance movement to get Americans to quit drinking so much, and women's rights movements. The Third Great Awakening is roughly mid-19th century into the early 20th century. It started with a tent revival meeting in New York City and then spread out from there to the Midwest. These are new denominations, active missionary work, the social gospel approach to social issues. And this is where we started to see the rise of that kind of Christianity where it's the job of religion to take care of the poor and the people that fall through the cracks, since the federal government was not in the business of doing that. And some claim it still isn't, but it certainly is a lot more today. That is, the social safety net we have today is way bigger than it was a century ago or more. And so this is where you see the rise of like the YMCA and freedmen's societies and a bunch of other volunteerist groups that evolved to help people. And that's a good thing. That's the Third Great Awakening. Then the Fourth Great Awakening, I guess you might say I was a part of that, is the late 60s and early 70s Jesus movement. That's when, in high school, I became a evangelical, born-again Christian. I've written about this extensively, so I won't dwell on it here. But just to note, I didn't even know I was in the middle of a great awakening, but apparently so. This was a non-denominational form of Christianity. That is to say, everybody recognizes some of the problems and even evils with organized religion. But why not have the Christianity without religion? That is to say, just a direct line to God and Jesus yourself. Just read the Bible yourself. And so I tried that in high school, and I went to this place called The Barn, which was one of these kind of weekly gatherings of people in which there was a pseudo leader, sort of a guy that played guitar, and he had Birkenstocks and long hair and a beard. He looked like the 1970s version of Jesus, I guess you could say. And, but I took it pretty seriously. I went to Pepperdine University after that, at the Church of Christ School. I took courses in the Old Testament and the New Testament and the life of Jesus and the writings of C.S. Lewis and all that. And so that went on for about 7 years. I even went door to door evangelizing, which is the whole point of the evangelical movement. And anyway, I eventually lost my religion and became a agnostic or atheist or whatever, religious skeptic, you might say now. But I don't want to talk about that here. The point is that we may be in a 5th Great Awakening. Some people are, I'm saying that it could be. Let's just think, I'll give you some examples of this. Last April, I was participating in a debate by the Free Press in Austin, hosted by Barry Weiss. Does the West need a religious revival? Okay, you're probably familiar with this already because I think I've talked about it before, but this was myself and Adam Carolla debating Ayaan Hirsi and Ross Douthat. Ross is a columnist for the New York Times and a journalist, and so his book is about how he was always religious, but he kind of refound his Catholicism. And Ayaan has a book coming out, I guess, in probably 2026 about her now widely discussed conversion to Christianity. She was really one of the four horsemen. Okay, so there was a lot more than four, but in any case, she was one of those who was very, very public about her atheism. And at the time when Christopher Hitchens and Dan Dennett and Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins' books all came out, and my own and a bunch of others actually. But she then, last year, I guess now a year and a half ago, found God and Jesus and became a born again Christian. And so I started thinking about that, and here is Barry's introduction to that debate, and this kind of is an introduction to this idea that we could be in a fifth great awakening. Over the last century, the Western world has steadily been losing our religion. Fewer than half of Americans now belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque. Less than a fifth of Western Europeans attend church regularly. In Sweden, over 75% of young people claim no religion at all. At the same time, our communities are suffering. Fewer of us are getting married and having children, and more of us are getting divorced. We're finding meaning in the culture wars, tearing ourselves apart over politics, and there's an epidemic of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and addiction. There's an economic and cultural malaise, and once upon a time, that hole, that God hole is the reference there, was filled with religion. It's a crisis of meaning, but is secularism really to blame? Has the woke mind virus taken the place of religion? I'll address that in a minute. This is called the substitution hypothesis. Continuing with Barry's commentary here, the percentage of Americans who identify as Christian fell from 90% in 1972, that's when I was doing my religious movement myself, to 64% in 2022, okay? 90% to 64%. While the religiously unaffiliated, the so-called nuns, those are people that tick the box for no religious affiliation on surveys by Pew and Gallup and Barna and other polling companies, rose from 5% to 30% in the same period. That is to say, when I was religious, it was only about 5% of people who had no religious affiliation, or at least admitted it. And now it's over 30%. And by the way, that's on average 30%. Amongst younger people, Gen Z and millennials, it's probably more like 40 to 50% data still coming in on that. According to Pew, the shift towards secularism has been even more pronounced across the Atlantic. Among Europeans between the ages of 16 and 29, 70% said they had never attended a religious service. But after years of decline, this trend may be starting to reverse. Just yesterday, this is in April, a massive new survey from Pew found that the share of Americans identifying as Christian has, after many years of decline, finally started to rise again. So the question I think that we're trying to argue about tonight is, are we better off with or without God? And then she finishes, one of the lessons, I think, of the past decade seems to be that you can kill God, but the human impulse toward faith remains. It just takes on a different form. Politics, you could argue, has become a kind of religion with ideological and political purity replacing moral virtue. Okay. So my answer, by the way, to the debate question, does the West need a religious revival, was no. Thank you. And although I expanded on that, obviously, but it remains to be seen what the bounce back in the last year or so in religiosity really represents in terms of trends. It could be because the Pentecostal church has made a startling increase in popularity in South American countries and maybe migrating back to North America now. that these polls are picking up. So it could be that Catholicism and mainline Protestantism, Baptists, and so forth are still in decline, but the Pentecostals, which are seeing an increase, may be accounting for some of this data on the increase. Anyway, so I think it remains to be seen. I will address the substitution hypothesis by quoting from an article we have coming out by Helen Pluckrose. Well, it'll probably come out the same day as this podcast or the day after. Helen's title of this article is "Why Secularists Calling for a Christian Revival Are Wrong." She writes, "It is not clear that the decline of religion directly causes the rise of secular ideologies. The substitution hypothesis is most often raised in the United States in relation to the critical social justice or woke movement. But if critical social justice arose because of declining religion, the last place we'd expect to see it, its leading theorist, emerges America, a country whose religiosity is closer to Iran's than it is to the rest of the English-speaking world." Okay, let me comment on that just briefly. Even though we now have strong documented data showing the decline of religiosity in America, it's still really high, right? I mean, you're talking about from 90% to 64%. That's still almost 2/3 of all Americans religious. Compared to most English-speaking countries in Europe, for example, that number is, way, way below that, more like 10% or 20%. Continuing with Helen's article, that the U.S., with its unusually high level of religiosity, was also the birthplace of critical race theory, queer theory, and postmodern variations on post-colonial theory, argues against the substitution hypothesis, not for it. Many vastly more secular countries where non-believers represent the majority of the population, such as the Netherlands or the Czech Republic, have not produced similarly fervent ideologies in absence of religion. Okay, again, this is the idea that, how can anybody believe this crazy woke stuff? Well, because they lost their religiosity, they lost their moral compass. They don't think there are such a thing as true moral values. So they filled that God-shaped hole with some kind of ideology that feels moralistic in nature, and that's wokeness or critical race theory or the BLM movement or any of those, that's the argument. I don't think it holds up. Most social scientists don't think so. It's the kind of thing you'll see on social media by commentators who, just pulling it out of their head, just this idea that one must be replacing the other. Continuing with Helen, atheists and skeptics would do better to ask why so many people across the West now seek security and dogmatic, illiberal ideologies, and to address the material causes of that insecurity, rather than advocating for a Christian psychological crutch as being preferable to a secular one. We could be of the most use in exploring ways to reduce material deprivation, ease existential anxiety, address political polarization, and meet human, social, and psychological needs in ways that don't jeopardize the rights of women, homosexuals, and atheists, and which have the benefit of also being true. I urge skeptics to recognize themselves as heirs of the Enlightenment and not to try to resurrect Christianity, but to rekindle confidence in the liberal tradition that made modern Western civilization possible, a tradition that values evidence, reason, pluralism, and the rights of individuals. If we wish to reduce polarization, mitigate existential anxiety, address real problems effectively, and build a society resilient to authoritarian capture, we must invest in those principles rather than retreat to the false comfort of religious narratives. Liberal modernity is imperfect, but it remains the best system for advancing knowledge and resolving conflict that humanity has ever known. Hear, hear. I would say amen, brother, or in this case, sister for Helen. Our challenge now must be to ensure that it endures. Indeed. Okay, so one of the threads in these books and in this debate, does the West need a religious revival, is that the question of whether religious claims are true or not is beside the point. does having a religious structure to a political, economic, and social system make it a better system, better as in more people are flourishing and rights and the rule of law and all that stuff. Well, I have a whole chapter on that in the moral arc, so I won't go through that here. But in short, it's sort of like saying there must be something to the Judeo-Christian worldview or the Abrahamic religious worldview or something like that that gives Western democracies and free market economies some kind of foundational structure. So we need that. And then you'll also hear, and it's also good for individuals, people that, some people need it. And you'll often hear, atheists even say this. It's what Dan Dennett called belief in belief. It's a little condescending. It's sort of like saying, well, of course, I don't believe Jesus was resurrected from the dead, or I don't really believe in God. But the little people need it. They need it for their structure in their lives and purpose and meaning, or society needs it. So, all right, I'll just sort of go along with it and believe in belief, even though I don't personally believe, something like that. So Helen's article is, basically saying that's not a good argument. And we could do better than that, by getting back to Enlightenment values and principles and so on. All right, let's go through some of these books because they're kind of fun. Charles Murray's book came out just this week. It's called Taking Religion Seriously. This is the Charles Murray of bell curve fame, but he's more generally a sociologist who has been studying society, economic, political, cultural systems for decades, for half a century. And toward the end of his life here, as he says, I just got to thinking about, these religious claims, and a lot of them seem to make sense. Charles's argument is not quite the one I just made, but others have been making, that it's good for society, although he does make that secondarily. Charles wants to argue that there are reasons to believe. Okay, let me just comment on that. There's different forms of belief. Let me give you an example. This book by Neil Van Leeuwen. Here it is. Okay. Religion as Make-Believe, a Theory of Belief, Imagination, and Group Identity. Okay, Neil's argument is, it's an unfortunate title because make-believe, it sounds like it's making fun of religion or belittling it like a child's type belief. What he means is that religious beliefs are in a different category than empirical objective claims. So, for example, I think this is the example he uses. You've heard me say on this podcast before. When the preacher says there's a parking lot in the back of the church, you can go check yourself to see if what he says is true. Anybody can. But when the preacher says God is 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the Trinity, how's anybody supposed to fact check that? How would I know? How would anybody know? It's a different kind of belief. It's a kind of, this is what our tribe, our group, our religion believes. And you can believe it or not. It just depends on if you are part of our group or not. It has a kind of a different epistemological foundation than empirical, objective, testable type claims. And I would extrapolate that to the resurrection itself. I mean, I don't think it's something you could prove. And it's something you either accept it or you don't. Christians do, Jews don't, Muslims don't, even though they believe in in the case of Jews, they believe in the same God as do Muslims. Even the same book, the Old Testament, anyway, for Jews. And Jews even think there will be a Messiah. They just don't think it was the carpenter from Nazareth that is the Messiah. So if the arguments and evidence for the resurrection are so good, why don't Jews believe it? Okay, well, I put this question to Ben Shapiro on his Sunday special, Accept Jesus. Why don't you accept Jesus as the Messiah?
Okay, so the reason that I don't accept Jesus as the Messiah is because I think that a lot of the arguments so Jesus as the Messiah is a different figure than anything that exists inside Judaism. So when people say that Judaism predicts the coming of Christ, the change in the nature of what Christ is, what a Messiah would be, is different from Judaism to Christianity. So Judaism never posited that there would be God come to earth in physical form, and then acting out in the world in that way. Judaism posits that God is beyond space and time. Occasionally he intervenes in history, but he doesn't take physical form. It's one of the key beliefs of Judaism, actually, is an incorporeal God. So that means that the idea is actually foreign to Judaism of a merged God-man who is God in physical form, but then dies and is resurrected and all this. It's just a different idea than exists in Judaism.
So you're not waiting for the Messiah to come,
right?
He's not coming in the.
I'm waiting for the Messiah to come in the form of a political figure, right? So the Messiah in Judaism is a guy who's going to come back and is going to establish peace in Israel and is going to assure that there's sort of a happier world with a bunch of political aspects to it, as explained by Maimonides. But he's going to die too, right? He's not going to come back and everybody lives forever and any of that kind of stuff.
He's a corporeal agent. He's just like us.
Right. And in the Jewish view, any person could be the Messiah. Any Jew can be the Messiah in the Jewish view. Right. So I could be it. Who knows? But it's not. But I'm not. But
you're off to a good start.
But that's a different view than the Christian view. So the argument typically made to Jews by Christians on this is that Jews it's forecast by the Bible. And for Jews, we have a whole different read when you read the Hebrew about why this may or may not be true.
But Christians claim the Old Testament predicts it's going to come, so you disagree.
Well, I disagree because I think a lot of these verses that are cited are actually misreads of the Hebrew. So actually, I read Hebrew, so I think again, that's not to disclaim even in the Jewish view, the impact of Christianity on world history, right?
Yeah, that's a different question. We're just talking about the ontological question. Right. Is there a God out there? And is there a Jesus, a Messiah, in physical form?
Right, so I have actual beliefs that run counter to the idea of God taking physical form as a human being, because I think that leads to a lot of weird side effects.
It sure does. Yeah. And so I think that goes a long way to, kind of getting a grasp of what we're talking about when people say, well, I think it's true. I mean, true in what way? Okay. If somebody personally says, it just works for me, like Ayaan Hirsi, this is what she started off saying. Well, I'm not saying you should believe. I'm just saying this is what I believe, and it changed my life. Okay. And her backstory will come out in her book. I know the details of this, but it's not up to me to share it. We'll see what she wants to share in the book itself. But let's just say, she went through a crisis, which she has mentioned, and that, accepting Jesus and having her children baptized and so on changed her life. Okay. Who can object to that? But then since then, like she did a public event with Richard Dawkins in which Richard, of course, pushed her on this. Like, you don't actually think this is true, do you? I mean, that Jesus rose from the dead. He was really dead and then he was not dead anymore. I mean, do you actually think that's true, the virgin birth and all the rest, the miracles? And, in this public event, she said, well, yeah, I do. Okay, so again, when you say, yes, I believe it, do you mean believe as in the objective, empirical, testable kind of belief or some other kind of belief? More like the analogy I use in my next book, Truth. Is it more like a literary truth where, no one in the right mind would ask if there were 4 brothers Karamazov in Dostoevsky's great novel, or if there was a Middle Earth in Tolkien's trilogy, or if there's a train station 9 3/4 or whatever it is in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. No one would ask that question. It's irrelevant. It's a novel. It's the story that counts. The story, literary truths are truths that are represented by characters and plots and events in a novel, and they tell us something about the human condition, but they're not literally true. And so this is how I read religious passages and stories and accounts, like in the Bible, as more like literature than empirical truths. But not everybody does that. I'm not sure why that is. I mean, why not just say, like, I'll give you some more examples of this, like Sebastian Junger's book. I had Sebastian on the show. In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. Okay, Sebastian, lifelong atheist, another one, says, you know what? I had this really incredible, wild experience. He had a near-death experience in which his father, who'd been dead for some time, made an appearance and talked to him, and they had a conversation. All right, so the book is mostly about all these things that happened to him and what he took from that. Okay. But, okay, why do you need to write a book? Why not just say in your head, this is an incredible thing. I can't really explain it, but, maybe there's this afterlife. And I will agree. I had, Sebastian on the show, and what I told him is that, could be, maybe there is an afterlife. No one knows for sure, right? So I guess we'll find out when it happens or not. But we're not going to find out in this world in some kind of scientific objective sense. But nevertheless, he went through a whole discussion, very well-written discussion, actually, of quantum physics and spooky action at a distance, and, the double-slit experiment, and how, weird things happen at the quantum level, and maybe there's some sort of quantum field in which our soul floats off into, and so on, this kind of quantum consciousness idea. Same thing similarly with Jonathan Rauch's book. I also had Jonathan on the show. It's a great book. It was really fun to read. He's not become a Christian or a believer of any kind. He's still a lifelong atheist. But that religion has a foundation for democracy. Christianity's broken bargain with democracy is what it's subtitled. And so he makes that similar kind of argument. Not that he personally has been uplifted by it, but Charles does. He says, after 25 years of being a secular atheist, I've kind of looked through the fine-tuning argument and the Big Bang argument and the fact that we have an objective sense of right and wrong, the moral law, near-death experiences, terminal lucidity also came up in this book, The Immortal Mind. This is Michael Enger's book on a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul. Now, Michael was already a believer, but you can watch my podcast episode with Michael and Christoph Koch, the great neuroscientist who's an atheist. Go back and forth on these particular issues, near-death experiences, and examples from neuroscience of where it seems like the mind is not necessarily dependent on the brain. It may be floating around somewhere else in some kind of a mind-like, soul-like substance or structure or something like that. This terminal lucidity is a super interesting case in which we are told, anyway, from these accounts, the data on this is not really great. It's mostly anecdotal, but it is interesting, where people who are terminally ill and on death's doorstep, and these are people who are not lucid. They have dementia, senility, Alzheimer's, or whatever. They're out of it, and just before they die, like within hours, all of a sudden everything comes back online. They recognize the loved ones in the room with them, which they didn't recognize before. All of a sudden they can speak, whereas they were nonverbal for quite some time after that. So, of course, people like Christoph Koch, the neuroscientist, well, then obviously, if that's true, the memories are still in there somewhere. They're just not accessible when the brain is offline like that under these extreme conditions of dying or almost dying. And so obviously, maybe, there's a lot about memory we don't know. But for people like Michael and others, Charles Murray, this is evidence of a mind that is not dependent on the substrate, that is to say, neurons, that it can exist separate from the brain, which of course immediately suggests that upon the death of the body and brain, maybe this mind, call it a soul if you want, floats off the connectome and off into the ether somewhere, the quantum field or whatever it is. Maybe that's what happens. Okay, I don't believe this, but it's not impossible, I guess. There are some suggestive results from quantum physics that, weird things like this happen. But we have to be careful. The fact that quantum physics is spooky and weird, and things like consciousness or terminal lucidity or near-death experiences are spooky and weird, that doesn't mean they're the same or one explains the other. It could be there's just a lot we don't know. In the next episode of Shermer Says, by the way, I'm going to talk about anomalous experiences that people have had, including myself. There's literally hundreds of stories like that lead me to think, we should keep an open mind, but not construct a whole nother worldview based on some particular religion. Another guest I had was Samuel Wilkinson. His book is called Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. Okay, I could have written this book. I did write this book, actually, The Science of Good and Evil, in 2001, and basically make an evolutionary argument for the development or evolution of morality and meaning and purpose in life. Okay, and then at the very end, he says, and by the way, I think there's evidence that this was kind of a goal-directed or deity or designer-directed process, this evolutionary process, to create these kinds of things of morality and meaning and purpose in life. And I don't see the need to make that one extra leap. At some point, we just hit an epistemological wall, and the laws of nature just are what they are. And some people need to make that next step. I love the book. I loved having him on the podcast. But again, why do people need to write a whole book about this? And I've been thinking about this fifth grade awakening. It could be that because we live in the age of science, and science is so powerful, so all-encompassing. I mean, it has filled so many of the gaps, the God of the gaps argument, that if you can't explain it, that gap, the explanatory gap, is filled by God. Science has been filling those gaps ever since the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. There's not much left. Here's another, but the author, Michel Yves Boulard, is coming on the show in a couple of weeks. God, the science, the evidence, the dawn of a revolution. Okay, this is that the gaps represent the place where the deity has tweaked the system. The moral, how did Immanuel Kant put it? The two great things, the two great mysteries are the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Okay, so that's what Charles makes at this point. The authors of this book, look at this thing. I've been plowing through it for months, but again, they're both religious. They're Christians, but and 400,000 sold in I think it was originally published in French. It's just recently been translated. Not even out yet when I'm speaking. I think it comes out next week. That you don't have to use faith. It's not just faith. There are good arguments, not just good arguments. I mean, you can say reasons to believe. Okay, this is my faith. And by the way, I also have some reasons. I'm not claiming that the reasons mean you should also believe. I'm just saying it makes me feel more confident in my faith that I have these arguments. The Big Bang, the first cause, the prime mover, the fine-tuning of the universe, the moral law within, the soul, whatever, these kinds of things, the mind, consciousness. These are, the hard problem of consciousness, the hard problem of morality, these sorts of things, free will, are the last gaps filled by God that science is, I think, filling, but not enough for some commentators. And again, it's the sense I get is that it's not enough to say that's my faith. What they want to argue is that it's really true in this kind of objective, empirical, testable kind of science. So you should believe it also. So there's that little leap right there that kind of bothers me. That this is what works for me. And it's not just completely random, like I like dark chocolate and you like milk chocolate. It's just a personal preference. No, I mean more than that. These big existential questions, Martin Gardner and William James and Miguel Unamuno, the philosopher, called this fideism. That is kind of a pragmatic truth claim that, on certain big questions like the existence of God, why there's something rather than nothing, free will and determinism, consciousness, that if science can't give a definitive answer, and it can't really yet, then it's okay to make the leap and just believe if it works for you. If it makes your life better, then fine. But as Martin Gardner always said, because he was a lifelong skeptic, I'm not claiming you should believe this. In fact, I think the atheists have better arguments than the theists. But I'm just saying they're not definitive, and so for these big questions. Okay, I'm all right with that. Fideism, fine. I loved Martin. He was one of my heroes and then colleagues and friends. And it just really threw off a lot of the skeptics like the Amazing Randy and others Like, how is it that the great Martin Gardner can believe this stuff? Well, because he's believing it in a different way. He's not claiming it's an empirical thing. These kind of books are. Like here's another one. Okay, I haven't read this yet. This book comes out in February 2026. Why I Am Not an Atheist, an obvious reference to Bertrand Russell's Why I Am Not a Christian. He even says that's where I got the idea for this. So I haven't read this yet. I just flipped it open. But again, it's just the power of anecdotes and personal experiences that people have. This is Christopher Beha. He's coming on the show. I'm going to enjoy the conversation. I'll be polite and nice. We'll go back and forth on this. But for example, he opens the book by saying, when I was 15 years old, an angel of God came to me at night, pinned me to my bed, and demanded that I put my trust in the Lord. This was no dream. I was awake. I am as certain of that as I am certain that I'm awake while I write these words, and a terrifying presence was communicating to me. I tried to escape, but my body wouldn't move. Through great effort, I finally yelled out, and my scream chased the presence away. My heart pounded as I caught my breath. Coming back to myself, I heard my twin brother Jim snoring peacefully in the bunk above. Okay, right there, that tells us. It's in his head. It's not okay, not in the room. Brother Jim didn't wake up. By morning, the sense of horror had passed, and I was still sure that something significant had happened. I never mentioned it, didn't tell my brother, and so on. Anyway, so I just started reading that. I looked up the references. I flipped through the book as much as I could to see if he makes any reference to sleep paralysis, because that's what that was. We now have a big database and lots of anecdotes. We've published this in Skeptic on this that happens to, maybe 3 to 5% of the population. During a deep sleep, they wake up and they can't move. They feel paralyzed. Now, the idea behind this is that when you're deeply asleep, your body shuts down and you feel like you can't move. In order to not walk in your sleep, like if you're sleeping in a tree, okay, not be good. Right? So we evolved this kind of sleeping in this supine position where you're super relaxed, the muscles are relaxed, and you don't move. You can't move. Okay. The people who have sleep paralysis wake up in that state but can't move their body. They feel like I can't move, I'm paralyzed. And then the added component is the sense presence in the room. There's some kind of entity in the room. And from there, of course, your culture tells you what to call it. Christopher Beha calls it an angel. In the Middle Ages, most people who experienced sleep paralysis called it demons. These were incubi and succubi harassing people in the middle of the night. In the mid-20th century and late 20th century, these were called alien abductions. Most alien abduction accounts, if you talk to the abductees, experiences, as they're called, happen at night when they're asleep. And of course, no one else in the house was aware that, the aliens came into the room and the spaceship, the mothership, was hovering just above the house. And none of the neighbors noticed, and so on. This is all happening in people's heads, okay? Now, okay, so if this is if he's building on that from that story, it would be good to, keep in mind, we have a vast body of literature now in cognitive psychology and neuroscience, all of which is recounted in my books and other people's, skeptics' books. Carl Sagan's 1996 Demon Haunted World has a beautiful section on this. We've had dozens and dozens of articles in Skeptic about these sorts of anomalous psychological experiences that people have. Very, very likely they're just in their heads. Not all. In the second part of this commentary, I'll do another one next week. Is it weird enough to represent a whole new worldview of the supernatural and the paranormal and then pick your religious belief or structure around one of those? No, it isn't. It's just weird things happen, and it's okay to say, you know what, I don't know. Science can't explain everything. And we're just left with that. A whole other book on that, just while I'm plugging past podcast guest Tanya Lerman's book here, How God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others. Again, it's this when people say, I was talking to God and he told me, or I was praying and God sent me a message, or, I heard a voice and the voice told me, go left, that are right, or marry this person, or take this job, or take this trip, or read this book, whatever it is that they communicated with God. Are they literally hearing voices like schizophrenics? No. That's not what people mean. When most people say, God told me to do this, or, I got this message from Jesus or God, they don't mean it like somebody who's having a psychotic break with reality. All of us can imagine it. All of us have a little voice in our head in which we talk to ourselves. We rehearse the day's events. We curse at our boss or somebody we had a fight with, and we rehearsed, the little inner voice happens, just a nonstop commentary. In fact, the whole point of meditation, I'm told, because I don't do this, is to shut off the inner voice because it's too chaotic and congesting to our other thoughts. And but something like that, it's still relatively new. Let's just say in the last, since we've been publishing Skeptic 33 years now, but I'd say in the last half century or so, that scientists have tried to get a handle on what's going on in people's heads, what's going on in societies and communities in which religious beliefs come and go. These great awakenings come, and then they fade, and then a new one comes, and so on. What is happening with that? Okay, so it's good to know that. Yeah, I think that covers most of the topics here that's been on my mind. I'm fascinated by religion. I'm not a religious believer. I call myself a religious skeptic. I'm an atheist. I don't think I would be surprised if there is a God. I'm not a strong atheist in the sense of, I would not say I know there is no God, because I don't. Nobody does. Can't prove a negative. The weak atheist position is more accurate. I just lack a belief in God. I like Huxley's word coined agnosticism, meaning not knowable. I think in some ultimate sense, as I've been referring to here, objective truth, scientific, empirical, testable claims about the world. I don't think God belongs even in that category. And therefore it doesn't rise to the level of knowledge, that is justified true belief. There's just not enough justification to say that belief is true. Okay. But I could be wrong. Okay, so next week I'm going to, and we'll just say this, Shermer says, number 3, we'll call it part 2 of the, kind of ideas of religiosity, the supernatural, the paranormal, anomalous, weird things that happen. I'm just utterly fascinated by these things, and who wouldn't be? They're super interesting and important in the sense that people can construct not just whole books as we've seen, but whole worldviews around it. And so we'll pick it up there. All right. Thanks for listening. It's been Michael Shermer, and we'll see you next time.